Okay, so dear colleagues, welcome to our seminar series. And today we have Susana Batel. She is a researcher from University Institute of Lisbon. She has been researching environmental psychology now for a couple of decades, I think. And yeah, something like that. I know we know each other since I think 2004, 2005. And Susana does really interesting research on the crossroads of social and environmental psychology, and we really enjoy, always her perspective. And I'm really delighted that she has accepted today and she found time today to come and talk to us. So, without any further ado, Susana, yeah, please.
Thank you, Elena, and again for the invitation to be here, and good morning from Lisbon, everyone. So today I'm going to basically talk about my research, and mostly even my more recent research. And with it, what I've been trying to do is to develop this critical environmental social psychology approach, as Elena also highlighted, to understand people, environment, and energy relations. And as you see, and I'll show here today as well, this critical approach also implies that we also often have to go beyond psychology and adopt a more interdisciplinary perspective to be able to understand and advance knowledge on precisely people, environment, and energy studies. So basically, I'll organize my talk today around these 5 points. I'll start just with a small prologue on the larger field of the social studies of energy and the environment. And then I'll argue for and the need for a critical approach, and present how I think this critical approach should be developed, and basically which are the kind of key tenets that this critical approach, and specifically in the field of critical environmental psychology, should look like or use. And then I'll just present some examples from my own more recent research, as I said, on resistance to renewable energy as more than and beyond NIMBY, through which I'll try then to illustrate some of those tenets of a critical environmental psychology and what can that look like empirically. And then I'll end up with conclusions and discussion with you, obviously. And I would also like to say that if you have any query or something that you'd like to ask throughout the presentation, also feel free to do that. Otherwise, we can discuss at the end. So to start with, I'll just like to talk a little bit why more and more the social studies of energy and environment, if we want to call them like that in this broad sense, are important. And clearly they are very important, and more increasingly so nowadays, because if in fact we have been having for instance, more and more conversations and acknowledgements that we live in this new geological era of the Anthropocene, it is also true, as I showed, in this image here, that there are still many countries and groups around the world that are still climate change skeptics, and that still are promoting practices that clearly go against tackling climate change. And so what we have in nowadays world's panorama, so to say, is precisely that, is a large mix of different practices, some of them that already acknowledge the Anthropocene and acknowledge that we do have a climate crisis that we need to address as fast as possible. But at the same time, there are also still some ideologies and groups that are still even trying to promote climate change skepticism to try and continue with fossil fuel as usual. So within this context, we also have at the same time more and more groups and people that acknowledge that precisely we are facing a climate crisis and that we need to move as fast as possible with so-called renewable energy or green sustainable transitions. And we have witnessed also a bit all around the world, the Fridays for Future movement, for instance, which has precisely been arguing for that, for the needs of a Green New Deal, and many other social movements and demonstrations have also tried to promote this message that we need to move away from fossil fuels and start not only using more renewable energy, but also, for instance, stop eating animals and promoting veganism and a big plethora really of other sustainable green practices. However, there are also issues with this call for these green sustainable transitions. And those issues are, from my perspective, two main assumptions that are still present in these discourses and narratives. Only be empowered and we can only understand citizens' relations with these renewable energy transitions, and if they are having a voice, by recognizing that the same power relations that were there before for the fossil fuel societies in which we live are still there as well for the renewable energy society. So, for instance, the multi-level governance that has been governing the European Union is still there, and it's still difficult for citizens and local communities at the local level to go through all the levels up until the European Union to be able to negotiate, for instance, renewables directives that are and associated policies that are precisely the regulations and policies that are pushing for the increasing deployment of renewable energy infrastructures. And so as critical social and environmental psychologists and social scientists generally, what we have to ask is precisely how are these renewable energy transitions being enacted, with which psychosocial impacts, with which impacts for local communities, for marginalized groups, for health and well-being. So by whom are they being promoted, for whom? And which renewables, what is renewable? So these are the types of questions precisely that a critical approach or agenda needs to ask. And for that, obviously, also we need to then bring into this debate and into these questions a lot of important categories and distinctions, such as, for instance, as I said before, between the urban and the rural, between the global north and the global south, between top-down centralized approaches or more bottom-up decentralized approaches. And these are all distinctions and categories that I am also going to use for talking about some specific studies in some minutes. So energy transitions then for carbon neutrality within neoliberal capitalism, and to sum up what I've just said, need to be considered as processes of political and cultural domination over humans and non-humans that create circuits of privilege and dispossession. And this includes the construction of specific subjectivities and associated psychosocial impacts in everyday experiences and on well-being. So more specifically, what are then the dimensions of a critical environmental psychology approach that I propose? So first of all is this idea of disindividualizing research and considering instead the social construction of meanings. Then the second aspect that it's obviously also very important, and as I've tried to make clear so far, is this idea that a critical environmental psychology approach needs to be concerned with revealing and contesting relations of domination, injustice, and exclusion including the ones that often are also perpetuated and reproduced by psychology itself. And so the ultimate aim of this research should be to promote social and political change towards equality and democracy. And in my research, I have done this particularly by adopting the theory of social representations as a critical approach that can help environmental psychology in adopting then this critical perspective as well. And I've done that precisely because the theory of social representations, and I don't know if you're very familiar with the theory, but obviously then we can discuss it further in the discussion. But the theory has always precisely been a theory that has thought of meaning making as something that is collaborative and constructed with the other. No? So it's what has been called the dialogic or relational theory that focuses on self-alter-object relations. It also has focused a lot on studying discourse and communication precisely to understand how change, how social change and resistance to change happen. And it has also always paid particular attention to the sociocultural, historical, and spatial contingencies that shape meaning making, that shape people, environment, people, energy relations in this case. And finally, it is, and it has always been what I've called here an articulatory epistemology. So it's very easy to actually use through the theory of social representations, insights and inputs from different disciplines and not only from psychology. And as I said in the beginning, this is for sure very much needed if we really want to understand people, environment, and people energy relations in a more complete and holistic way. So moving now to the focus, the more kind of empirical focus of my talk, I would like to now give more concrete illustrations, let's say, of these more theoretical aspects that I've just talked about by precisely going through some empirical studies in which I've tried to show how resistance to renewable energy then is more than and beyond this idea of the not in my backyard phenomena. And so precisely what me and other colleagues have tried to do in this research is precisely to show that often resistance to renewable energy infrastructures or to other environmentally friendly or what are often presented as environmentally friendly technologies and infrastructures is not only a response that is selfish and ignorant and irrational, but often has to do precisely with socio-environmental justice issues. So NIMBY, which goes for not in my backyard, actually had its origin in community movements against precisely environmental injustice in the USA in the 1980s. And so it started precisely as some communities had to deal, for instance, with waste dumps near where they lived that created very serious health problems such as cancer and in children and in adults. And it was as they started noticing this and understanding the relationship between living near those toxic facilities and these health problems that they started protesting against that. And so this is how the NIMBY concept first showed up. But then what happened was that throughout time, it started being used by politicians, also by technology developers and companies, and even by the media, even by academics, to actually refer to people that are irrational and selfish and ignorant and oppose these specific types of facilities, such as wind farms or co-incinerators and prisons even, which are often presented as for the common good, no? And so this would be people that precisely, despite recognizing that these facilities are for the common good, do not want to have them near their backyard, and so they are often deemed as irrational, selfish, and ignorant. And as I've just said, actually, academic research also tended to reproduce and perpetuate this kind of incorrect definition, let's say, of NIMBY, so this NIMBY myth, and often has tried to actually reduce it as well, and specifically in relation to renewable energy technology. So there is a lot of research that still tries to understand NIMBY and tries to overcome it because it considers it as a key barrier to the renewable energy transition. Also, another associated problem is that academic research also continued to often conceptualize people's attitudes and beliefs as individual, as I argued before, and also stable throughout time. And therefore, not considering that actually, even if people, for instance, in a first moment might oppose a certain energy infrastructure, at a later moment, they might accept it or even support it, and vice versa. And the third aspect is that academic research in this area has also often identified social psychological factors that help explain local opposition, such as risk perception, local negative impact, place attachment, but then for only proposing some mitigation measures of those impacts that allowed renewable energy infrastructures to be constructed anyway. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that academic research has also tended to depoliticize renewable energy transitions and specifically the deployment of renewable energy infrastructures by just supporting that deployment and without considering if actually that deployment is always socio-environmentally just. So what can be the contributions from a critical environmental psychology approach then to kind of contest this type of framing that has been so habitual in academic research so far? So it can contribute by asking key questions such as, for instance, which psychosocial impacts of NIMBY as a representation of local communities? Also, how can NIMBY and associated discourses and representations be used as political resources to contest and negotiate changes in local communities? And also, how can these protests and local movements help to identify, understand, and contest democratic deficiencies and social and environmental injustices in our societies? And so I'm now going to very quickly go through some empirical examples, as I've said, to illustrate these three questions, say. So these empirical examples are based on research that I've conducted with Patrick Devine-Wright in the UK already some years ago. And we managed to gather quite some data collected through focus groups that were collected in these two case studies. So one of the case studies, the Mid-Wales one, we conducted focus groups with local communities that were affected by the construction of a new wind farm and new high voltage power lines that would connect with it. And the other one, the Hinkley Point C case study, was of a nuclear power plant that was going to be deployed and also associated high voltage power lines to connect with it. And basically what we've done was to use these focus groups to explore different issues. And so I'm always going to be talking about material from these focus groups, but as I said, to explore different issues. So regarding, for instance, the first question, which psychosocial impacts does NIMBY representation creates or can create? This is precisely one of the issues that we explored in this data. And basically, and again, applying that critical theory of social representations approach to this, what we departed from was this assumption that NIMBY is obviously a representation that is co-constructed by socio-historical, cultural, and political contexts, by public policies, the media, developers, and also by local communities, citizens, etc. So what we were interested in was, okay, so NIMBY is this representation that is circulating in a lot of nowadays societies, and that is circulating often as a pejorative label for people, for local communities who oppose these projects. So does that representation have psychosocial impacts for those local communities and for those citizens that do oppose those projects? And what we could see from our data is that actually this NIMBY representation does seem to impact on how citizens and local communities represent themselves as able or not, or as having the right or not to have a say in decision-making processes related with these energy infrastructures. And for instance, here in this extract, just a small example of that, in which a participant says, but basically discloses that I'm not particularly well educated and I'm not a clever person, which is clearly resonates the NIMBY representation of people being ignorant and not having enough knowledge to have a say in these type of things. And with this, we can clearly see that these NIMBY representations and associated ones can have this type of disempowering impact on people. So for sure, this is a key avenue for research from a critical environmental psychology perspective, is to better understand which psychosocial impacts NIMBY, but also other related representations can have in empowering or disempowering people to participate more actively in these type of decision-making processes. Then the second example that I've brought here was to illustrate another key avenue for research from a critical perspective, which is also how can then NIMBY, but also place attachment and other related representations and resources be used as political resources to negotiate these type of projects. So here, for instance, the type of approach that we adopted was to look at how people, so again, these local communities in the UK, how did they represent the landscapes that were going to be affected and the places that were going to be affected by these energy infrastructures, and how, if and how they used their relations, their place attachments with those landscapes and places to negotiate these energy infrastructures. And what we know from research in environmental psychology is that often they adopt a perspective to look at people-nature relations, in which nature is seen as natural, as a cognitive universal. Whereas critical psychology, but also human geography, for instance, they have already a long tradition of precisely looking at nature and landscapes as socially constructed categories or issues or objects that precisely can be used in a political way to advance certain projects, certain political projects instead of others. And so what we aim to investigate was precisely if people would look at the relation between these renewable energy infrastructures and the natural landscapes where they would be deployed as compatible or incompatible, and how they would argue or negotiate that. And that is specifically relevant in the case of the UK, because there is this representation, which is very hegemonic there, of the idyllic rural countryside, England's green and pleasant land, which has been reified throughout the centuries in books, cinemas, by governments. And it's very related then also with this British identity. So we were particularly interested precisely in seeing how the deployment of these renewable energy infrastructures in the British countryside, which is such an important place for British identity, how people would manage this and try to negotiate with the government so that these energy infrastructures wouldn't be deployed there. And what we've seen is that indeed, and this was very interesting for us, was that what people often did was to recognize that if they were opposing this, the deployment of these renewable energy infrastructures in the British countryside, they could be seen as NIMBYs. And so what they've done was to use other formulations of their place attachment, say, precisely to avoid the NIMBY accusation and be able to still protect those landscapes that they wanted to protect. So for instance, in this extract, that is quite clear. This person says there's a criticism that we are somehow NIMBYs, but it's not just that. You are also, again, custodians of this area. And this is very interesting precisely because it shows that NIMBY and place attachment can be used as political resources to negotiate responses, and in this case, opposition to these energy infrastructures, and to try to oppose them, but in a way that is considered more legitimate. So obviously, it's much better to be seen as custodians of an heritage, say, that is of everyone, of the British citizens, rather than just being NIMBYs that are just opposing these projects being constructed near the place where they live. And here again, another example in which basically people also use this hegemonic representation of the British countryside to negotiate, again, try to prevent the construction of these energy infrastructures in the place where they live, again, in a political way, basically by acknowledging that this representation of the British countryside as somewhere to protect and to preserve is very strong in Britain. And so they used it to protect their own identities, their own place identities and attachments, but in a way that didn't seem, again, as NIMBY, that didn't seem non-legitimate. So basically what this research shows as well is that people-place relations, places and landscapes are political subjectivities and projects that are constantly negotiated between different groups with different ideologies and political orientations. And so also in psychology, and in environmental psychology specifically, we have to more and more consider and represent really landscapes as these ideological and rhetorical representations that are used to negotiate responses, in this case to post-carbon transitions, but also to other issues. And I think this is a very important point as well, is to understand that, for instance, in this case, when people in the UK are negotiating their responses to these energy infrastructures, they are often also negotiating their responses to a certain type of ideal for what rural areas are and for what the British countryside is, that often is also associated with issues such as racism and xenophobia, and who is part of the British countryside and who isn't. And so also environmental psychology has to be able to adopt this kind of more holistic and, as I said in the beginning, relational approach that looks at how these different things are interrelated in people's minds and practices. So basically, this perspective then generates important debates about, what is NIMBY? And it actually makes us then, as I've been arguing, to reframe this type of research from NIMBY and social acceptance to socio-environmental justice. And it also highlights, and this is something that actually environmental psychology has also been recognizing and doing more and more, that it is very important that when we are studying place attachments and people-place relations generally, that we are also very careful in promoting this relational and progressive place attachment or senses of place. So places attachment, so to say, that allow solidarity, commonality, and well-being. And it's also our role as environmental psychologists to promote these conceptualizations of place attachment and sense of place, rather than other more conservative ones. And finally, the other example that I will just very quickly go through is just to illustrate how critical environmental psychology can also contribute to uncover the democratic deficiencies and socio-environmental injustices then, as I've just said, that are also created not only by fossil fuels supply chains, but also by renewable energies supply chains. And here, I'm not going to go much in depth in this example, but I would just like to highlight that basically what I've been doing is to try and make sense and illustrate empirically this idea of renewable energy colonialism, which again departs from this need for critical environmental psychology to adopt this socio-environmental justice or injustice approach more and more. And so it makes us look at renewable energy infrastructures not only as the wind farm that, for instance, is deployed in Wales, in the UK, as the example that I was giving, but also how for deploying that wind farm, there are other local communities and other landscapes and rural areas that are affected because there are other materials that are needed to construct that wind farm, for instance. And so this idea of renewable energy colonialism aims precisely to research which impacts, which psychosocial impacts, which community impacts are there for communities all around the world that come from the green transition. And these impacts can be at the transnational scale, precisely, for instance, when companies from the global north construct wind farms in the global south because there are less regulations there that allow people to participate in decision-making processes and all that. And so it becomes easier to deploy those energy infrastructures in many countries in the global south. But then what are the consequences for the local communities in the global south? And renewable energy colonialism can also happen at an international scale, so also within the global north, between countries in the global north. For instance, here there's an example of that happening between the UK and Ireland. And they can also happen intranationally. And I think here this is like the example or the dimension of renewable energy colonialism that often is more neglected or forgotten, which is that it can also happen, as it has been happening, between rural and urban areas, or vice versa, between urban and rural areas. And there are already some authors working on that and showing that, for instance, in Denmark and in Norway. And I've also done some research looking at that in Portugal, basically exploring the psychosocial impacts of hydropower plants across different socio-political regimes, from dictatorship to democracy. But basically, the idea is precisely to recognize that rural areas are also often being colonized in this perspective of just being of resources just being extracted from them without nothing being given back. And so there are a lot of, as I said, psychosocial community impacts that are socio-environmental unjust, and that critical environmental psychology should more and more explore and reveal. So, and here just to highlight that this becomes more and more important, as I said, not only because what I've emphasized in the beginning of this talk and the fact that renewable energy transitions are being more and more pushed for and at an increasing speed, which is going to create more land pressures and more social conflicts, but also because, as we are also all aware, and at least in Portugal, for instance, this has happened, that there has been also a rise in right-wing populist political parties' discourses. And these right-wing populist discourses often precisely build up on as well these unjust renewable energy transitions to be able to gather the support of rural communities and areas to their side. And so there is this danger that actually, if we are not careful in how renewable energy transitions are done, and if we actually promote renewable energy transitions that are quite unjust for local communities, that then we might create a backlash even to any type of renewable energy transitions. And we might even increase climate change skepticism, which, as I've started my talk by highlighting, is still high for certain political parties and ideologies and in certain countries. So I think one key message that I wanted to leave here is precisely this, is that critical environmental psychology does have a very important role in highlighting and analyzing these socio-environmental injustices, precisely because it should have this role also on trying to stop that climate change skepticism increases again, and that we go backwards in these issues and in understanding people's roles in climate change and the climate crisis. So just really to wrap up, I think that critical environmental psychology and critical social psychology really, they do have really important roles to play in nowadays societies, because there is the climate crisis. And as I've highlighted throughout my presentation, one of the key ways that is being proposed to tackle it is this green energy transition. It's these Green New Deals and a lot of associated technologies and measures and infrastructures that come with them. And so there really is an important role for critical environmental and social psychology to help to make these transitions as socio-environmentally just as possible. And this also might imply trying to understand how can people and communities, namely, organize themselves differently. And for instance, within degrowth perspectives, within lifestyles that are not based just on increasing energy consumption and continuing with energy consumption as we know it. And so just my final remark then is that I've talked here obviously a lot about rural energy transitions, if you want, or because it's where renewable energy infrastructures often are deployed, is in rural areas. But obviously, we also have to consider these same issues when we think about urban green transitions. And for instance, something that I've also started to look into in my research is how smart cities are also creating and how issues such as green gentrification and energy poverty. And so that's also something that critical environmental psychology can have an important role in better examining and understanding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susana. That was an amazing talk, really. Maybe I will just ask a first quick question and then we go to the discussion. So, well, I think you are raising extremely important and very rare points. I think they are rarely discussed, these kind of issues. Probably, we sometimes come across, and well, of course, they're also relevant mostly for societies that already have some sort of pro-environmental agenda. For instance, when we talk about Russia, where we're just trying to, think how we talk to people about climate change, we are very, very, a long shot from anything like this. And, with the government, probably nowadays they're more discussing as a source of renewables, hydrogen power, and some sort of, solutions like that, because politically it's opposing to anything that is, like wind power or solar power. Which is, just a particularity somehow. But yeah, so in a way, we're talking about more developed societies, but in another way, I think it's extremely important, because we always ignore this point of how we do sustainable transition globally, and at whose account it's going to happen. It's usually, it's again those who are the victims of climate change who are going to be the victims of green transition. And basically it all comes down to the same point that you mentioned, which is this, idea of prosperity, constant growth, and so on. So obviously it looks like degrowth is probably the only solution, but how can we potentially achieve this? And even to persuade people to, adopt some sort of actions, like, I don't know, what we call pro-environmental behaviors, it's hard. But then what do we need at the society level, probably, to start and, at least start talking about these kind of principles and, to be able to transition to that one day. Also, given that we don't have much time left, in terms of what is happening to climate and so on, as we know.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously those are very interesting questions, and they're very challenging as well. But I think that actually in what your first were highlighting, that yes, obviously, like, different countries will be at different stages, even because that's it. There are certain ideologies and political orientations that even can. So even if you were like at a certain stage in a country, if then it changes political orientation, let's say, because the government changes or something like that, you can always go back. And I think that's one of the key issues that is very challenging and important to acknowledge as well. But so just to say that I think that the what we should do is or try to think about is the same, even if we are at different stages, because I think it's all about getting people on board and engaging them in a way that precisely can't be unjust or can exclude certain people, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to move forward, be it to just start to raise awareness for climate change, or be it already to, okay, awareness is raised, but now how do we promote renewable energy in a way that is also not unjust and all that. And I think that's the key point, is precisely involving everyone and not leaving everyone behind, which is also like something that the EU says a lot, but it has to be done properly. And what I mean by this is precisely by using these more critical decolonial approaches, because and that implies, as you said, to adopt also this global perspective. And for instance, there's this work by David Uzzell and Nora Ratzel. Their more recent work is very interesting, precisely because it shows that one of the main aspects is to involve blue-collar workers that are working in, still fossil fuel industries, and that obviously tend to resist addressing climate change and transitioning to renewables, because they will lose their jobs and they will lose their and so it's they're doing a great job precisely in trying to show that if you do involve these workers, for instance, they actually can be the leaders of the green transition. No? So I think that's the key, is trying to see how we can involve everyone. And I think then for, considering like degrowth and all that, I think that actually people are, a lot of people are already ready for that. And you see that more and more you have like eco villages and transition towns and all that, that show that a lot of people are more willing to live with less if they can live better. And I think that's precisely what we have to explore more also as environmental psychologists, is how can we promote those lifestyles and kind of perspectives that show how people can live better with less. But I think that for that as well, we really need to precisely research these examples that already exist of people doing that. And I think that, again, it can't just be also asking of people to just like change radically, no? And I think it also has to, for instance, explore even what people are already doing that often is also already kind of sustainable, even if not necessarily fitting in the definitions of what academics and policymakers define as sustainable practices, no? But I think that often people in their everyday practices, they already have tools and knowledges that are sustainable. And I think sometimes it's just researching those more and identifying those more. So practices that are already ingrained in people's everydays and that we could promote more.
Yeah, that is a really interesting, thanks for your answer very much. And I think it's a really interesting point that we should also try and see some other practices, that are already there. And probably how to use them as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we have quite a few people here, so I'm sure I would like also to ask something. And please unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hello, Susana. Thank you for a great talk. It was really interesting for me. This is a bit hard multidisciplinary topic as well, which is not really close to us as people who work in Russia. So I feel due to your presentation that I miss some context of renewable energy acceptance. So I have maybe a really childish question for you, but I'm sorry, I need to ask it. Why it is important that public accept these renewable energy transformations? Because as I feel, this is the explanation is that if people accept it, they don't protest, so politics can accept these programs more, the local politics, and if people deny it, so the politics of local governments, they don't want to develop this topic, and that's why we miss the introduction of renewable energies. But maybe I'm wrong, just how I see this perspective, because I feel this question from European side is maybe works different in a way. So why it's so important for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's it. Like it's very important because as I try to highlight, the pressure for building renewable energy infrastructures like these large scale ones, such as wind farms, solar plants, hydropower plants, will be more and more in the next decades. No, precisely because what governments want, and specifically talking about European Union, is to replace fossil fuels by renewables, and that will for sure increase land pressure, and also that's it, social conflict, because then, for instance, and I show that in the slides, but I didn't pick up on that during my talk, but even these in Brazil, Brazil, the government and even the media, everybody says that they have around 80% of renewable energy production, as if it is like a very good thing. But actually, when you look at it, most of it comes from large hydropower plants that involve the displacement of indigenous communities that then have like tremendous health impacts and impacts for well-being because they're moved from their kind of livelihoods and all that. It also impacts tremendously ecosystems. So actually biodiversity is lost, forests, all of that. So it is important to study renewable energy technologies and infrastructures acceptance because of this, because they do create a lot of impacts. And obviously sometimes they also bring, for instance, economic benefits to local communities. And so both local communities and local politicians will be happy to accept them. But there are also cases in which the negative impacts are perceived as much higher, and so they don't want to accept it. But the problem is that so far there is not this right to say no. So there is such an agenda to foster these renewable energy infrastructures nowadays that it's very difficult if you live in a place and you don't want a wind farm to be built there, for instance, to be able to reject it. And so the problem is that then you are constructing infrastructures that really can't be considered sustainable if they have not heard, the affected communities and taken into consideration their voices and opinions. So I guess it is important because of that, because otherwise we might end up in the long term with very, very dissatisfied citizens and communities that, as I said, might then even promote a backlash to measures to mitigate climate change. I hope this helped.
Yeah, thank you very much, because I really thought about it. Maybe in Portugal or in England, if people protest, that then the business will not do it. But I really interested, like that your point, maybe not really but yeah, it was important idea for me that you said, okay, they don't have really right to say no, so they don't perceive it sustainable, and this is the question. So exactly. I get it why it's so important. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, please?
Yeah, if I may, I'm very glad for having bumped into this seminar by chance. Thank you very much, Susana, for this really interesting talk. I recognized a lot of the arguments and the theories and the perspectives from environmental psychology and the critical turn of it from Susanne Normann's work here in Norway with the Sami populations, and she's used many of the same ideas as you in studying how the Sami people here were both affected by the climate change and affected by the measures to work against it, right? By being displaced by these huge wind parks and farms. So there's a lot of dilemmas here, and I always wonder, do we need psychologists to point at how this is unjust? Isn't it enough with the law? Isn't it enough with seeing the pictures? But of course, we are part of this, and we should also work towards pinpointing how and why these processes are unjust, and how we can make it better in some way. But I was wondering, and this is probably not a question for a psychologist, probably a question for a philosopher or ethics person, but there's so many groups and specific people that are being unjustly treated in this green transition, but how can we kind of find the threshold? Because say if we as a global community don't manage to meet the challenges of climate change without destroying some people's livelihoods and places and the ways of lives, this question of epistemicide, say a group of people are displaced in such a way that they cannot continue with their cultural and social ways of lives. And as was mentioned earlier, we have very little time to address these things. So I don't know whether you have some thoughts on this. Probably too big of a question, but I will give you
no, thank you. Yeah, for sure, it is a very big question, and it's yeah, very challenging issues. And as you said, like it's yeah, it involves like these like different dilemmas and all that, because it's so complex. But at the same time, I think that that's it. Like, for instance, the role of psychology and also like other social sciences, I think it still needs to be used. They still need to be used more to actually highlight these injustices, because, as you said, despite the data being there and it being quite clear for for us, for instance. I think that, and if you read like a lot of research that is published, it's still very much with this idea of yes, we just continue with economic growth, but we just replace fossil fuels by renewables, and that's done. And even like economists and political scientists have shown very well how if you do that, that it's going to go, you know, collapse as well. And precisely because of that, because a lot of the for instance, now in Portugal, one of the big controversies is about lithium mining, which is very much needed for electric cars and for storage for renewable energy generation. So and still it is like using a non-renewable resource that again is affecting local communities also here in Portugal, because it's being explored here. And I think that what is quite contradictory here is that, for instance, there's this lithium mining now going on here in Portugal, in the north of Portugal, and is affecting these local communities that precisely have a very sustainable way of life, because they just live kind of the land and all that. And that is a really good example that shows this contradiction of this way of creating sustainability, you know. And so I don't have any like specific good answer to your question, but I think it's precisely trying to find this balance. So I'm not also saying that we shouldn't build some like renewable energy infrastructures and try to make that move, but I think that it really needs to be done with also lessening consumption and removing, so finding some post-growth alternatives, because otherwise it's going to be impossible no to also not continue contributing to climate change really, and to the climate crisis somehow.
Thank you very much. I agree. Maybe we could develop some kind of discourse around not in my economic growth.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, I think Fatiha wants to ask a question as well.
I have a question too. Thank you, Susana, for the talk. It's really interesting. The more interesting part is that I just recently watched an episode of John Oliver. So I guess he really represents the like mainstream liberal media and how this media treats people who are exactly talk about that, like not in my backyard. So he was talking about people who were against building new power grids like in their territory, farmers, etc. So, and I really noticed that he uses this like dismissive language, like they're opposing it not because there is some legitimate reason for opposing it, but just because like they're not kind, like they're those conservatives. So this is like some opposition that's been created. So this was really interesting, and how you explained it, and how this, I guess, this narrative, this way of talking about people who oppose, who are NIMBYs, is kind of not very productive and not very good for the long-term maybe development of renewable infrastructure. And also I noticed that you've been talking about some indigenous communities, and it feels like there is a lot of different people who might be against building this infrastructure for different reasons. So for example, indigenous communities might have their own like agenda and their own view, and the other, for example, agricultural farming communities, they might have their own views. And you were also talking about that you took interviews from some of the people. So what what I'm interested in is what are the like main concern? Because again, as I said, the mainstream media, when they talk about these projects and the opposition to these projects, they never really talk about the reasons. They pick one, the most like ridiculous reason, for example, it's just not pretty, that's why they're against it. So we don't really get to understand, like, maybe there are some legitimate reasons they're against these things.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, for sure, like many of the reasons, if not all, are legitimate. And I think that then like it depends, like, so for instance, in the cases that I was giving from Brazil, often it even like goes against human rights. And there was this very relevant report that was published recently that showed precisely how, so they've analyzed human rights indicators for renewable energy companies. And it showed that renewable energy companies have almost as many non-compliances with human rights as fossil fuels companies. And that includes even sometimes like violence against defenders of land, for instance, in Brazil. That because hydropower plants, for instance, often involve, and even in Portugal still recently, there was one that was built that involved displacing whole communities, and a lot of households and all that. So, for instance, that's for sure a very legitimate reason for not wanting, one of these energy infrastructures to be built there. And even because that's it, often it's not only that people have to be displaced, but it's also that they live there because there was an ecosystem there that allowed their livelihoods, and also allowed precisely to preserve biodiversity and all of those issues. But then sometimes there are also like reasons that are legitimate, even if they also operate more within the current kind of neoliberal capitalist system. For instance, recently, as I was saying, there was this sale of 3 large hydropower plants in Portugal to a French consortium. And when that sale was announced, there were a lot of local protests. And those protests were mainly based in the fact that these power plants, these hydropower plants, they never gave anything back to the rural communities where they were built. So these communities never received anything whatsoever from the hydropower plants. It was like so ridiculous that even when they were built in the 50s, 60s, they didn't even, so these communities weren't even electrified. So they weren't electrified, and they were like next to these huge hydropower plants and had to like suffer all their impacts. But also now, when they were sold, there were all this revenue generated by the sale of the hydropower plants. And again, nothing was going to these communities. And obviously, well, not obviously, but at least in Portugal, as in at least some other countries also in the European Union, rural areas are really like, depopulated. They are often in need of jobs, of economic development, really to be able to survive. And so what these people wanted was to have some revenue from the hydropower plants. And that's it. That's legitimate as well, because if they are receiving the negative impacts of the hydropower plants, yes, obviously they should be compensated at least somehow. And in this case, it was like, what they wanted was economic, like financial compensation, which is also fine, I guess. And that's it. So there are like lots of different reasons. And sometimes, yes, they also have to do with like visual spatial impact, because it can really change a certain landscape and people-place relations and all that. So yeah, that's why I think there is still much scope to do research in this area and to and specifically from environmental psychology to highlight the psychosocial impacts of these infrastructures.
Yes, thank you for your answer. It's interesting
Thank you
how you highlighted that those renewable energy infrastructure companies weren't very ethical and were so keen to demonizing the fossil fuel industry, but we need to kind of keep those industries accountable too. That's yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Susana, can I also ask a question?
Yes, please.
Sure.
My name is Irina, and so I'm a psychologist by the background, but I'm working in the interdisciplinary field for a very, very long time, so from the end of the 90s. And what I'm really interested is first that there were a lot of things done in the field of environmental conflicts, not from the psychological point of view, but from the ecological economics point of view and so on. There are a lot of works of, for example, Juan Martinez Alier, maybe you know his works, and so he also have a volume of these descriptions of the conflict and how this psychological research correspond to this, to his ideas of this, how to say, group of researchers. That is my first question. And the second is, as we know, there are also, for example, in UK, a lot of people who support the renewable energy. And there is also, how to say, a chance for example, in Britain that we do not have in Russia, to make your choice for the company that you so have the electricity from. For example, to have this energy mix, to make a choice for renewable energy company, to support it by what you are buying from them. So what is this, how to say, second side of the coin? In your
Thank you very much. So yeah, starting with that, I think that is that's precisely a key issue as well. I think it's increasing transparency at all levels. That includes transparency about the supply chain of renewable energy infrastructures, but also transparency from an energy kind of consumption point of view, and being able to choose and to know what you are using and consuming. But actually, that's it. Like, for instance, in Portugal, in the UK, I haven't lived there for some time. I don't know how it is now, but in Portugal, just only not too long ago, you also have this liberalization of having different energy companies, and you now can choose. And you have already some that will obviously use renewable energy, and but it's very difficult to trace if you're using it, because sometimes it's a mix. And so and that's precisely the issue, is that I think it's a lot of these practices from energy companies and developers are still very opaque, and I think it's still very difficult. So I think that then it creates this kind of false idea that we are being more sustainable because we are using renewables, but actually without knowing exactly if we are or not. So I think one important aspect as well, and again, that I think it's interesting for environmental psychologists to explore, is precisely more people's relations in their households and in their everyday with energy and electricity, and their awareness of these issues, and if they know where it comes from and how it is being used and all of that. And yes, and regarding the first question, I think that actually it is quite interesting how I think there's more and more this convergence between these more political ecology perspectives and actually these critical environmental psychology perspectives, because that convergence is precisely about these socio-environmental justice issues and impacts on livelihoods and well-being, and this idea of the good life, and how we can promote that within this idea of post-growth, degrowth alternatives. So actually, I think that, more and more it makes sense for these different disciplines to work together and to contribute to each other.
Thank you. I can make a remark that in 2005, when I was one of the organizers of a big conference in St. Petersburg on ecological economics, new economy, and so on, we first introduced a psychological session there for environmental psychology. And I think that for these people coming from different other disciplines, from economics and so on, it was really very, very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
We had a very productive discussion with them.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Susana, I think, I mean, one thing that I would really wish after hearing your talk is that, first of all, maybe the ideas of critical environmental psychology make their way to IPCC work. You know that our colleagues, quite a few of our colleagues are now working for IPCC, and that would be a really important thing to do, because when we, for instance, asked, you know, occasionally there are calls on, you know, exploring the impacts of deep sea mining. You know, you mentioned the north of Portugal. I suppose that's inland exploitation, whereas deep sea mining is for the same reason, you know, but that involves unprecedented, basically, changes to the ocean. It's an extremely you know, so far what we know about it, it's an extremely dangerous practice for the whole ecosystem, not just for the ocean itself, but also for the coastal communities and for the wildlife and for everything. So basically, that means that, yes, as you're pointing, it's still trying to extract something that is not renewable, and basically there will be an end to it one day anyhow. I think what you are saying, just overall, that it's, yeah, because this kind of, you know, projects, you know, we have applied once for the Belmont funding in that area. It hasn't, you know, succeeded. It's quite competitive, so it's okay. But still, there was this ethical issue that, you know, what we are going to discover with our research and anyhow, and whether, you know, potentially there is a chance to give green light to, even though that we show that everyone is concerned, yeah, would that be sufficient to not to give green light to this kind of initiatives? And it's very, very tricky and very uncomfortable, actually, as a researcher as well. So, you know, I think one of the most important things probably is changing ideology somehow. And if this kind of critical ideas made their way into, you know, the work of IPCC, which is really important nowadays, I think it's a flagship for, you know, this kind of discourse, at least, even if it takes, you know, ages to change something afterwards. It's really important. And on the other hand, you know, what you're talking about also just provides another proof that, you know, what we try to, basically anything we try to do in our sort of civilization that, you know, leads us to improvements, growth, and so on. Basically, well, constantly, it's not my, you know, it's not my saying. It's basically, it's the philosophical definition of samsara, you know, the term for describing basically reality in Buddhism, saying that samsara is basically the image for it is a woman who is trying to disentangle her hair, and by trying to disentangle each knot, she is entangling everything more. So basically, you know, when we try to, now we try with the renewables, the next thing, I don't know what it will be. But again, if it's made with the same principle, that we need to do more, to do better, and so on, it's going to be the same results. So I think systems views that everything is connected. So it's really important to explore actually what we're doing. Yeah. What you are saying today is very much, I think, about that it's not just we don't have that specific goal of, you know, sustainability only, but we need to consider other things that we probably make worse along the way. And it's really important to understand all these intricacies and understand it from a multidisciplinary perspective, to know what is happening with technologies and so on. If we have this kind of thing in our education, you know, this kind of system thinking, it probably helps us to take more responsibility what we're doing. It's just you know, kind of thinking, but I think it's kind of possible to also introduce here and there, so that, you know, understanding is a little less, you know, linear kind of, yeah, because growth is also, I think, goes in that Cartesian mentality.
Yeah,
that,
exactly.
and that's what has brought us to trouble. You know, technologically we're starting to develop as a Cartesian civilization, and that's where we are at the moment. I'm still hopeful that we can, you know, try and probably survive. I really don't know how, but we need basically a very deep system change, probably.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And yes, and I think like what precisely why it's important also then to have these insights from other disciplines, and as you said, this holistic kind of system thinking approach is precisely because then it helps us to recognize this, no? And the problem here is really like capitalism and how it is capitalism creates and reproduces the structural inequalities, and then that helps us understand that yes, the climate crisis is related with racism and with historical colonialism and all that, and that everything is together, no? So I think that is really important, and specifically for psychology, because it is a discipline that generally has struggled a lot with moving beyond that Cartesian, like positivistic, individualistic perspective, and it has even damaged a lot in that respect, because it has reproduced that type of thinking. And so I really think that is very important to decolonize it as well as a discipline. And I agree with you that we have to start somewhere, and I think also through education and teaching and trying to also, as you said, achieve or get to these places of important decision making, like the IPCC reports and all that. It's really, well, what we can try to do. Also, I think engaging more and more with activists and social movements, because like I also think that at least in certain countries, they able to I think I lost you there for a minute. But yes, but social movements and activists and NGOs, I think, are also more and more gaining more strength and being able to influence more decision-making processes. For instance, here in Portugal, and obviously it's always a combination again of many factors. But just recently, social movements, really like civil society, managed to organize a series of actions to stop like fracking and the exploration of oil, like in the coast as well. So actually then there was like a moratorium now for that not to being explored anymore. So these are also for sure ways for us to try and promote more this type of critical perspectives.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you're doing around this. It's really important, I think.
Yeah, thank you too for the invitation again, and for all the interesting questions and comments. And yeah, I hope to see you soon somehow.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, let's keep in touch. Thank you so much, Susana.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you too to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.